Good evening and welcome to this special presentation from Downtown Albuquerque News and the Santa Fe New Mexican. In just a few short days, voters in the city of Albuquerque will begin considering a proposal that would see the construction of a new soccer stadium and event center, most likely somewhere in greater downtown. The $50 million bond issue could well be supplemented by additional state government funds, some of which have already gone to pay for an extensive study that identified the downtown area locations. New Mexico United, a soccer team that has in recent years won the hearts of thousands of people across the state, looks set to contribute $10 million plus annual lease payments. Needless to say, the construction of such a large facility could have all sorts of impacts on the look and feel of the downtown core and the adjacent historic neighborhoods of Morelos and South Broadway, where the top two possible sites are located. If it also unleashes a wave of investment in greater downtown, the implications could ripple across the city and even across the state. To put it mildly, you never know quite what will happen when you start throwing money like that around. But if the stadium question is coming at Albuquerque at 100 miles an hour, it is already in the rear view mirror of some of our neighbors to the north. The city of Colorado Springs has just finished what we are proposing to start, rather. Earlier this year, they opened Widener Field, a new stadium located at the southern end of their downtown core, and the team playing there, the Switchbacks, is even in the same league as New Mexico United. Given how much we have in common with Colorado Springs, right down to the mountains framing half of the skyline, it seemed like a prime opportunity to compare notes. So tonight we've assembled a panel of experts from that city to see what we can learn, and I'm going to welcome them one by one, and we'll do just a little sound check here to make sure everything is all set. First up is Susan Edmondson. She's the president and CEO of the Downtown Partnership of Colorado Springs. Welcome to the show here tonight, Susan.
Good evening.
Awesome. Ari Knopp is the owner of Streetcar 520, a restaurant located just a few blocks away from the new stadium. Ari, can you hear us okay?
Hello, good evening.
All right. Sounds good. And finally, Robert Carr is the Vice President of Operations for Widener Apartment Homes. And we'll get into this in a minute, but which Widener Apartment Homes actually paid for much of the stadium and is putting up a bunch of housing around it. Robert, can you hear us okay?
I can. Thank you, Peter.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. And to anyone watching tonight, you can send in your questions for this panel to a special email address we've set up. It's stadiumquestions@gmail.com. I'm kind of surprised it wasn't taken already. Stadiumquestions@gmail.com. But Robert, I'd like to start with you and ask about the financing package for all of this. From what I've been able to read about it, it was about $13 million of state funds, and the rest, which I wasn't quite sure if it was about 40 or $50 million, was actually taken care of by your organization, Widener Apartment Homes. First of all, have I got that about right? And how did that seemingly unusual financing package come together?
Yeah, Peter, that's just about right. About $13 million of the funding for the stadium came through the Regional Tourism Act in Colorado. That was an act that our state legislature had approved, I believe, in 2013. I have that right? Susan's nodding. That's it. When Susan
Actually, a little earlier. We got it in 2013, but the act was a little bit before that.
Okay. And that's basically a tax increment funding mechanism that provided funding for 4 different projects, including our Olympic and Paralympic Museum, the
recording in progress,
Hibble Sports Medicine Center, Air Force Academy Visitors Center, and the sports venue was originally one sports venue, and that got split into 2, our stadium as well as the Robes and Arena at the Colorado College campus. And then the rest of the funding came from Widener and also the Reagan family, who are the founders of the Switchbacks soccer team.
And so that's seemingly unusual to have the private backer spending quite a bit more on the stadium than the public funds here. It's we have the opposite situation here. How is it that came to be in this particular circumstance?
Well, for us, it is a unique situation. We're an owner and operator of apartment buildings, so building soccer stadiums something I ever imagined I would be a part of in my career. But there's a story behind it. The owner and founder of our company, Dean Widener, grew up here in Colorado Springs. This is his hometown. And he's lived in Seattle for many, many years now, but he still has this really strong affection for the city of Colorado Springs. And so he wanted to do something big in downtown Colorado Springs, partially to give back to the community that gave him a lot growing up, but also our desires to develop multifamily housing in the downtown core of Colorado Springs. And this gave us an entryway into developing apartments downtown.
Yeah, and I'll ask one more question of you, Robert, before I expand to the rest of the panel here. Tell me a little bit more about how that is going to work. So you've in some cases I've heard of these projects being referred to as large real estate deals that also include stadiums from time to time. Is that what's happening up there? Is the stadium just kind of a feature of a larger apartment construction project for you?
Well, in some ways, yes, but it's also the stadium and the soccer team and the other events that take place there are a separate entity, a separate business that we fully expect a successful separate business as well. But from our standpoint as an owner and operator of apartments, having this amazing amenity out the front door of your apartment is certainly a plus for us.
Okay, so and how many apartments are in the pipeline from your company or already built because of this?
We have a big hole south of the stadium right now. That is our first phase. That's 408 apartments. It's a 7-story building just to the south of the stadium. And then we will build to the west of the stadium approximately a little less than 800 more units. So about 1,180 units is what we have planned adjacent to the stadium.
Okay, very good. And Susan, can I ask you about any additional investment that you see in the pipeline here, be it residential or otherwise, in terms of what are you looking out there for and what's already happened?
Well, I would go back to, as Robert was describing, this entire tourism act and the sort of suite of attractions that were a part of it. Some that are located elsewhere in the city, but in downtown through this state tax increment financing that enabled both Widener Field, the soccer stadium, the opening this week, 3,400 seat hockey arena at Colorado College, and then the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum. And so the combination of all of those, what I think that they served to do was really set a vision that set a path for downtown that really excited investors and became an impetus for others to say downtown Colorado Springs is a great place to live, as well as, again, attracting new businesses and supporting our smaller businesses as a real driver for things. So downtown Colorado Springs has been one thing we've been very behind in for a city our size. You don't have to be a big city to have people living in your urban core. And we've been very behind in that. And that's been a very high priority for us for several years. And we now currently have about 3,000 units that are either recently completed or will be under construction by next year, plus a much richer and deeper pipeline beyond that. Yes, a little bit of that was started before the stadium and the suite of projects were in play, but it really helped to accelerate the excitement about what urban living means. And certainly with Widener's investment, both with the stadium, but also then they saw, right, this is a great place for us as apartment builders, that people want to live in an environment like this. So I think what it really did, like when I talk to investors, whether they're local or more often now too, folks looking from elsewhere, from out of county at Colorado Springs, we could say, here's what's going on. Here's why someone living, if you're building new apartments or you're wanting to open a business here, here's what they're going to have in their lifestyle. And that has really catalyzed a lot of interest in downtown Colorado Springs. And frankly, this is a big contributing factor. It's not the only factor, but it's a major factor. And we are absolutely seeing really people from across the country that I deal with on a weekly basis now saying, I'm looking at Colorado Springs. This is the place that makes sense. And that we're creating a really good lifestyle here, right? That you can live in, whether it's Widener's apartments or some other folks, and you're going to be walkable to Ari's great restaurant. You're going to be walkable to the stadium and have a really great lifestyle. So it gave us a story to tell.
Could I get you to dive a little bit further into the actual mechanics of the psychology of how someone decides to invest? Because, some things you say, like the idea of 3,000 apartments, that has some folks in downtown Albuquerque drooling positively, I'm sure.
And we never would have imagined it a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean,
if Albuquerque can't imagine it, it can change in a few years.
I mean, there's a proposal to do 200 units, and that was front page news just a couple of weeks ago. So on one hand, I think what you're saying would be very attractive. On the other hand, we have up the hill from here a number of stadiums for our minor league baseball team and the UNM Lobos, and the development up there has inspired basically nothing around it. It's kind of it's not exactly suburban, but it's more your standard, stadium surrounded by parking lots. What exactly is it about a stadium located downtown that causes investors to think, I need to have what they're having?
I bet folks with switchbacks could maybe speak better to this, but I think what switchbacks gained, they were already in our community, right? They were in a suburban stadium. That is still, being used for other community purposes, and has a very strong family following. So they've retained their family following, but now like civic leaders buy box seats and younger millennials and Gen Z, and it's much more and a complete evening out. And I went to Switchbacks games when they were in the suburbs, and if you wanted to have a bite to eat or go out to a drink before or after the game, you physically had to get in your car and drive on busy streets for quite a ways to find the place you were going to hang out before or after. And now it's much more that whole package, right? That you can meet your friends and meet at Ari's place or many other great places, and then also have a great after experience. And that is very, very different. And so for us as if you will, managers and stewards of our downtown, we love that before a game, we now see in a true urban environment, people crossing the street at a street light, and there could be 50 people crossing the street as they're walking to the game, and families and all sorts of folks. And so that energy that's created is very, very different than everyone arriving in their individual vehicle into the big parking lot in the suburbs, and then everyone having to depart in their vehicle all at once. And maybe they find a restaurant or a bar a mile or two away to hang out at, but there's not that convivial feel of like, oh my God, we just won and we're all hanging out and cheering or whatever. You just don't get that kind of closeness to things. So it's a very different feel.
Could I put it another way? It sounds like you're saying that the difference between a stadium that inspires economic development and a stadium that doesn't is the fact that if the stadium is downtown, a lot of elements of the experience are not efficient. But not efficient in maybe a good way, depending on your point of view. It's like it takes longer to get there. You have to walk around. You have to meet people there. It just takes longer, and you spend more money.
It's not as catalytic economically. It's a good thing. It's good for our community to have a team they can cheer on. But if you're looking at sort of more catalytic economic development, that occurs kind of more in a denser urban environment where this attraction then catalyzes other businesses and other growth.
Okay. Ari, I want to turn to you here because you kind of see this on the front lines. You operate a restaurant very close to where this stadium has recently been completed. I guess could you tell us just a one sentence bio of your restaurant, how long you've been operating there, and what changes you've seen as this sporting infrastructure is implemented in Colorado Springs?
In one sentence.
I've two or three.
I've actually had a restaurant in this location for 14 years. For 11 of those years, though, however, it was an Irish pub. The stadium moving here was a huge contributing factor when I renegotiated my lease for another 10 years in this location. And I completely overhauled my entire concept to sort of mold and help with this whole urban renewal development that began a few years ago.
And so what sorts of, I mean, it sounds like you're obviously counting on a lot of extra customers coming because of these developments. Have you, and with the caveat that the pandemic has made every bit of analysis along these lines really tough, have you seen success with that? I mean, are you seeing a lot more people coming in either on game day or otherwise?
Quite so. I've seen a huge transformation since the stadium has been built. I knew it was going to be wildly beneficial for not only my business, but all the other local businesses around here. And actually did a corporate sponsorship with them for this season, and I'll likely do it with next season because it is so incredibly beneficial for the revenue, like I said, not just my business, but all of ours around here.
Okay, and is there any way for you to tease out how much of this improvement has come as a result of the stadium versus the new housing that has come in the area?
So since there's an apartment building directly across the street, 187 units, one of which I occupy. Since that came on board along with the stadium, my revenues probably increased, I'd say, by about 35%.
Okay, so I mean, is it fair to say housing was a pretty big factor? Because I mean, people think stadium, they think 20 or 30 games per year, and it's great on those days. But what about the rest of the year? So how do you kind of tease those two apart?
Housing definitely plays a huge role in it. Not as much right now because they have not yet been completed. I'm sure as soon as they will, just based on the revenue that I've personally generated from the apartment building across the street, I can only imagine it's going to continue upwards growth once more come online.
Okay. Sounds good. I think I'll throw this out to all three of you, whoever wants to chime in. One thing I was struck by reviewing the newspaper reports of the lead up to the stadium is the political consensus that seemed to have generated around this. It's a pretty hot topic in Albuquerque right now, and there's some significant opposition. You all didn't seem to have any, at least none that made the Colorado Springs Gazette. Was I just imagining that, or was there significant opposition to this?
I'll start. I will say, so again, this broader package of, if you will, tourism attractions and things that were designed to both serve the community, but also bring out-of-state tourists, which, as Robert mentioned, in 2013 is when Colorado Springs received this state tax increment financing award for multiple projects. Absolutely, were there naysayers, were there a lot of folks asking a lot of questions and very concerned. I will also say it's amazing how with things like this, once they're built and successful, you can't find a person who ever said they were against it. Like they somehow seem to have disappeared. With this project in particular, again, without going into too much detail, there was some state incentives, again, that were part of a whole suite of projects. And frankly, this piece was the one that was least baked. It was a sports facility. And it was considered perhaps it would be for our AAA baseball team. Like, it was not yet defined who it was for, where it would be. And there was not, if you will, a broader entity. Some of these other projects already had, associated with a university, or, they had a home, if you will. And so there was definitely challenges with how do we make this particular piece, the sports center, happen, that was tough. But once the location was identified, once switchbacks were identified as the team and the plan, then I think things really coalesced. But I will say things like location mattered. At some point there was a suggestion of a different location in downtown, and for us downtown, we also are very mindful of land use and how we create a great walkable environment. And there was a location identified that we said, this isn't right. And it wasn't that we were against it. We just said, we're making a decision for many years to come. We've got to make the right decision about how this is going to work for everybody. And so we were saying, we appreciate that this effort, but this is not the place. This is not the way. And then when many players and wonderful community folks came together with the right location and with Widener's incredible support behind the Switchbacks team, then all the parts started coming together in a really compelling manner. So I certainly would not pretend that they're like in any community initiative, you can have people of differing viewpoints, but when those elements started gelling, the excitement started building.
Surely the comparatively small contribution taxpayers made to this particular initiative helped with the politics. Is that, would I just be imagining that, or what do you think there, Robert or Susan?
Well, I think certainly the fact that it was a smaller portion of the total was helpful. It also was helpful that these were state tax dollars that essentially were going to be paid no matter what. It was just a matter of whether Colorado Springs was going to get some of that back or not, or that would go to some other community. And so, there were some misunderstandings and misconceptions about how all of that worked. But definitely I think the amount of private investment into the project helped. And, I think we tried to engage the community really positively through the process. And, we've been here a long time too. We've operated in the community a long time. And so I think those things helped us. As Susan said, not everybody was for it. A lot of naysayers and a lot of people that said it would never work. Why would anybody want to go watch a minor league soccer team? And now every time I go to a game, I look around at my neighbors and city leaders that are there, and it's remarkable. It's amazing.
Okay, and a quick note to Ari, we were getting a little background noise, so I muted you, but if at any point, please feel free to unmute yourself and chime in here. I can mute you, but I can't unmute you, so that'll be on you for future comments. Let's talk about an issue. I'm not sure if it was an issue up there, but it's definitely an issue here. The two top stadium locations are in historic neighborhoods where fears of gentrification run pretty deep. Fears of literal physical displacement also run pretty deep, even going back decades to an urban renewal effort many years ago that physically destroyed a lot of homes in a good chunk of one of these neighborhoods. Is that something you faced going into it, and if so, how did you deal with it? I guess start with what was the historic character of the neighborhood where all this development is happening, and how did you pull off that transition? And Ari, you raised your hand, and go for it. We'll need you to unmute there. Nope, we haven't. Hasn't happened yet, and we may have frozen here. All right, tell you what, Ari, we'll come back to you. I'll click the S to unmute button. But Robert or Susan, if you'd like to tackle that, what was the neighborhood looking like, and how did that transition pull off?
I can start a little bit. So this location is very much near, if you will, an entryway into our city. As you exit I-25 and Highway 24 into downtown, this is very close to that area. The actual site was a long vacant industrial site. So it was already scraped, big empty lot right at the kind of entryway into our community that sat there for many years. And much of the directly adjacent area was also sort of industrial, which is very much where Widener is building many of their new apartment homes. So there's not been physical displacement of individual homes. That said, this stadium is adjacent to an older neighborhood called Mill Street that is a much more lower income neighborhood, historic neighborhood of a lot of very, very small single family homes. I think when we talk about what does this mean to all of that, we have concerns about this neighborhood, but it's not directly about the stadium. It's about what Colorado Springs is experiencing citywide, right, of housing affordability issues that are occurring at a much larger scale. That is something very important for our community to deal with, but it's not a direct stadium thing. I think some of those challenges for this neighborhood that we're addressing would be occurring whether or not the stadium was there because of much of what's going on in Colorado Springs. So it's an important issue, but the stadium itself was not something causing displacement, if you will.
Ari, I think you're back with us. What do you reckon on this topic?
So as I stated earlier, I've been in this location for 14 years. So I've seen all of the transition take place, and say that yes, there was a lot of concern about affordable housing. However, I do want to say that I think it sparked several of our local developers to sort of get imaginative and plan other projects throughout the city and nearby that are also very affordable. And coming from a local business owner, I will say that it has helped tremendously for me to remain in business here. If this wouldn't have taken place in my neighborhood, I definitely would not have renegotiated my lease here. And
Robert, just how oh, go ahead. Please continue. Sorry.
And the shelter remains there.
Okay, I think we're gonna. All right, we may have to come back to you. The connection's pretty choppy there, I'm afraid. So let me actually, yeah, let me pivot over to Robert here. How affordable are all these apartments that you're building here? Are they market rate, or is there some portion that's not, or how are you addressing all that?
Yeah, so Widener, we're market rate developers of apartments and operators. So we don't do tax credit properties or affordable housing, so to speak. We have a pretty varied portfolio of properties. So within Colorado Springs, we have a wide range of price points. With new construction, when you're building it, it's expensive, and especially the type of construction that we're building, where you're doing, parking that's below grade, and then a wrap style. It's an expensive type of construction, and as a result, the rents have to be a certain level to make that type of construction make sense. And so we're not doing affordable properties in this development that we're doing. We did make a conscious decision to make a portion of these units be pretty small, efficient units that we think will be there'll be a lower price point that might allow other people to have entry into this downtown market that might not otherwise have. And they're making that trade-off kind of for size versus cost. And, we think that that's one way to bring their market rate, but they're more affordable units than what you might see in a larger floor plan. And a lot of people, we believe, coming into this market they're moving because they want the lifestyle. They want to be able to go to the soccer matches, and they want to go to Streetcar 520, and those are the amenities. And it's not so much about having a big apartment or a big space. But I will say that any development and any adding of units in a market it helps affordability because it's supply and demand. So even though we're bringing in market rate apartments that will not be cheap, that supply helps overall affordability. We have to, have supply in order to make that work. And I think as Ari alluded to, there are developers in town. In fact, one of our first developers downtown built a couple beautiful little buildings and is now taking those buildings, the equity from those buildings, and building more affordable product around town. And so it all tends to work together. It's complex issues around affordability, but I think we all are interested in having a wide range of housing in Colorado Springs. It's important to have housing for everybody.
Yeah, so I guess you're making a sort of classic economist argument that the more supply, the better when it comes to housing affordability in general. And I guess from my experience reporting on Greater Downtown Albuquerque, that tends to be true. However, there's also an optics issue, and maybe this has come up with the adjacent historic neighborhood you're dealing with. It can be a pretty tough pill to swallow if there is a very emblematic development, a very iconic big thing going in that is perhaps indicative of a larger market that is becoming more and more unaffordable, more out of reach, and potentially, raising property taxes and threatening people's ability to stay in their homes, or raising rents and forcing them to move to other neighborhoods. Now, there's a lot of discussion and argument over how extensive this is here. I imagine it's the same out there, but and maybe it's just a sheer matter of public relations on this question. Like, how do you address that sort of point and concern that you're likely to hear from other neighborhoods? And how do you, and maybe this is your role and maybe it isn't, but if it is, what do you see as your role in helping these other neighborhoods enjoy some of the benefits of the G word, as we were referring to it earlier?
Want me to answer that?
Sure, yeah.
And I think, as again, what we do as a business is develop market rate apartments. And so, but we do have an understanding that a healthy housing market, again, has to have product at all different levels, and it has to have for sale product. One of the issues we have in Colorado is that because of our construction defect laws, it's really hard to build condos. And so that's something that needs to get fixed, so people have that entry level. But also, we're very supportive of organizations that provide housing in many different ways, and try to be engaged in what's happening locally with housing at all different levels. So
I'll just maybe add a little bit to that as I mentioned earlier, residential growth has been our top priority in downtown for many years. Literally the first product that started moving the needle, and this actually preceded the stadium, was a 33-unit apartment complex. This was a developer who stuck their neck out, took the risk, built something without any comps in the market, without anything to kind of, justify doing this, right? And as Robert mentioned, this small developer was very successful in doing this and is turning her equity into doing other wonderful projects in the community. But that particular project was our first new construction for rent living option in the downtown core in almost 50 years. So when you have that much pent up demand, the first things that come to market, obviously they can command, there's high demand, right? They're going to command a certain price. But the fact that we now have thousands of units in the pipeline, that's how the price gets moderated. And it's absolutely academically, statistically proven, right? We have wonderful developers building a variety of things. But the more we add, that's where it comes in, because then people have multiple options. Right now, if you want an urban lifestyle, you have a couple options that are all leased up, and it's competitive to get on the wait list, right? And so the more we can add in all variety, that's what's going to make much of this accessible to more folks. So it doesn't happen in 1 year or one particular way. But I've said, and again, we know cities across the country now are really facing challenges with housing affordability and attainability because of soaring costs with labor and materials and all sorts of other things. If the rest of Colorado Springs was delivering as many units as downtown, we are a city of nearly 200 square miles and downtown is 1 square mile. If the rest of the city was delivering as many units as we are, we would solve our housing issue right there. I know that's a very simplification. Not every square mile is developable that way, right? But we are more than delivering on our 1 square mile of providing more housing stock for folks.
All right, very good. And before we switch gears here, Ari, I want to cut back to you here. We were having some technical difficulties, but if there's anything in that discussion you want to add, I'd say go ahead and unmute yourself and speak now. You're good. Okay. Very good. Sorry, hazards of doing a Zoom profile.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the quietest area in my restaurant with the poorest connection.
No, that's quite all right. We're glad you could join us from work there. It's on the front lines of economic development, I guess, in Colorado Springs. All right, let's talk a little bit about homelessness. Now, when I was a wee Colorado college student back 20 years ago, wandering around downtown, there was a problem then. I imagine it has not improved since, if Colorado Springs is like every other city. Did the homelessness crisis that all cities of our size are facing influence the debate over how and when to build this at all, or in any sense complicate the effort?
I'll start. Truly, honestly, I don't think that came up in this issue at all. Absolutely, the larger issue of housing and how we provide a variety of housing is a big issue citywide. Homelessness was not related at all to getting this attraction built in downtown. But to my, and I would be honest if I thought that really played into the conversation. I don't. It's an important issue, but it's not an issue that directly relates to this.
Yeah. I think, would you concur, Robert?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Sounds good. All right. Now something I suspect will be a slightly more salient political angle on this, and that's parking. So we all live in sprawling Western cities where a few core modestly dense urban neighborhoods are surrounded by sprawl and low density housing. How did the parking debate go when it came to addressing what I imagine are the serious concerns of people worried about how they were going to get to games or how they were going to get to do their normal business downtown once all this sporting facility and housing was added? How did that all go? And maybe we'll kick it off with Robert here, if you want.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start this one because parking was, I would say probably a good 80% of the questions and the pushback that I heard leading up to building the stadium was, where are people going to park? Where are people going to park? It was a mantra. In fact, my kids still tease me every once in a while. We'll be going to the game and I'll be like, but where are we going to park? Because they know it's a hot button for me. And, in all honesty, those were legitimate concerns. When you think about having a stadium, having 8,000 people there for a game, 15,000 people there potentially for a concert, people have a hard time wrapping their mind around, well, where are all those people gonna park their cars? And in all honesty, it's turned out to be a complete non-issue as far as I can see. And maybe Susan and Ari have a different perspective, but I have not, since we've opened, I've not had one person complain about parking. And I think we have this dispersed model of parking. We don't have a big parking lot around our stadium, and that was by design. We don't need one. There's plenty of parking dispersed throughout Colorado Springs, and I think it's actually really good for the community. Because even when I go to a game, I live on the west side of Colorado Springs. I come downtown with my family and we go eat somewhere before the game. And then with everybody else, we walk over to the stadium and have that experience. And it's not more than a 10-minute walk from anywhere that I go before the game. And it's just really turned out to actually be kind of a pleasant experience going to the games. And the other thing that I would note is people don't rush out. If you go to a game, you go to a Broncos game and it's just a sea of parking around that stadium, people start leaving right in the middle of the fourth quarter because they got out there before people leave. That does not happen at Widener Field. I mean, honestly, it's one of the things that I've loved the most about the atmosphere there since we've opened. And I was just there Saturday night for a game, and people just, they're not leaving. They're hanging out. They're waiting, win or lose. They're there because they're with their neighbors. They're with their friends. And it doesn't matter if you leave early. It doesn't have any difference on your egress, because most of these people are walking down to Tejon Street, or they're walking farther downtown and then, having a drink or having some food and then going home. So I think the parking, for as much notoriety as it got before opening the stadium, I think it's really been a non-issue, pleasantly.
Did you build any new parking for the stadium? Surely a few spaces.
We didn't build any new parking. We have some ADA parking that we created on the land that we have surrounding the property. And when we build our multifamily projects, we are overbuilding the parking there. So we'd be required to have about 300 spots for our first building, and we're going to build 720 in that building. And we'll do the same thing in the 3 buildings that we have there. So we will build in extra parking adjacent to the stadium, but we really didn't build anything extra prior to opening the stadium. Now the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Museum has a big parking lot that's a block and a half away from the stadium, so that's been utilized. And there's also city-owned parking garages that are a 10-minute walk or less from the stadium.
That is a fairly similar model to what we've got here, although the city hasn't been too open about its actual plans on parking, but they've hinted that those fairly nearby city-owned lots would be a key factor there. Do you have? I want to get a little bit more into the logistics of parking, into the nitty-gritty here. Is there like a shuttle system, or is it just these dispersed lots?
And I can talk a bit about that, if that's okay, Robert.
Yep.
So I do think it's important, a couple things. One, you have to have multiple ways for people to get around, right? Not just in their vehicle. So we have a wonderful bike share system, and they do valet parking at the stadium. Next year, we will be launching a circulator downtown that will be a kind of a free fare, circular route. It will be very beneficial on game days, but to make that circulator work, it's not just about 20 game days and another, 10 concert days or whatever. It is there to serve the, wide variety of thousands of employees and residents and hotel patrons downtown. That's the way a circulator is going to make sense, is that it's working 7 days a week and serving a variety of uses. We had a pedicab company that then also, started doing operations and such. So it's important to have a lot of different ways that people can get conveniently and safely to a facility like this. But I would strongly say the biggest risky one is actually making the mistake of surrounding your facility with a crater of surface level parking that creates stormwater runoff and creates a dead zone all the other days when there's not a game. That would be far more detrimental to your community than the idea of people walking 5 minutes or 10 minutes, right? So yes, it's important to communicate where the parking is. It's important to manage your parking properly. You need your meters in front of your businesses. Meters are there to create churn, right? So that someone may park at the metered facility to go to a restaurant for 2 hours and leave, so that the businesses can have people coming and going, and that someone intending to park longer term is going to a parking garage or a surface parking lot or whatever. And as Robert mentioned, there is a nearby large surface parking lot, a few that will eventually get developed. But again, the timing and the sequencing is actually working out quite well. And I will say, for example, when I go to a game, I have a parking pass in a city parking garage for my office, and it's about a 10-minute walk to the stadium. So of course I'm like, I'm going to park where I already have a parking pass. So that's where I park when I go to the game. And that's probably on the little bit further outskirts. And that garage is still very empty. Like, I mean, there's people there, but it's like people are absolutely choosing their path. And, you know, we have more supply, I think, than even with good parking studies than was realized. And that's what you want in your downtown, frankly, is that energy of walking, you know, parking near Ari's business and then walking there and walking back. And of course, you have to have your ADA accessible facilities for folks and all of that. But the energy is created from, and I get it, we're similar cities, right? We are sprawling Western cities. So we are having a cultural change. We have to get people to understand that you can walk 5 minutes, you can walk 8 minutes. Everyone's okay. You actually had a pleasant experience, but you've got to make sure your sidewalks are safe for people of all abilities and disabilities. And you have to have lighting. You've got to make that infrastructure work so that everyone has a safe experience in their few minutes of walk. So that's important, but that is a much more minor investment in creating a great downtown than a multi-million-dollar parking garage or a big surface lot that's going to sit empty. To build a new facility for a handful of games or whatever a year financially doesn't make sense. You've got to have other demands around that all the time. The one thing I will say, just to be fair, because this is near a certain neighborhood, that we are needing to do better about having some residential parking permits nearby here, so that people living in homes, particularly homes that don't have garages, can have a space available for them. And we're working on that, right? But it's working remarkably well.
Yeah, and that's touches on something I was going to ask, because our stadium locations, actually either of the top two would butt up against some residential neighborhoods. So what, knowing what you know now, probably Susan for this question, how would you design a program to protect the street parking options of nearby residential neighborhoods?
I think one is just recognizing that parking management, like everything else, is a profession. There are people who know how to do this and do this well. You don't want to invest in over parking, if you will. But just like near our university, the neighborhood near our university, there are residential parking permits so that students and others aren't spilling out into neighborhood parking, right? So it's very easy to have a sort of residential parking where, no parking allowed on the street on these days or at these moments or on event days or whatever. And so I think that's important to respect nearby neighborhoods. But truly the biggest thing is don't create a giant parking crater, if you will, because that will really, frankly, be a real kibosh on economic development, to create dead zones of big empty spaces. So, yes, it takes some thoughtfulness. There's not one easy answer to it. And that distributed model is better for economic development. It's just going to be better for everybody. And you're not either overbuilding or underbuilding your parking amenities, if you will, for folks.
All right, very good. Ari, could I turn back to you here? When it comes to parking, I imagine you would either you would know if this was a problem by now. The stadium is open. You would either have customers complaining, or you would see a dip in your bottom line if they were not coming due to parking concerns. What are your customers telling you about parking? And since you are a downtown resident as well, what are your own experiences and those of any downtown friends you may have?
I think I was among the minority 10% of the population that did not have an issue at the beginning of this with parking, for many of the reasons that Susan just mentioned. It really forced our community to take a hard look at our cycling infrastructure and our our fleet of e-bikes rather, and to utilize so many areas downtown more efficiently than they weren't being utilized at all. So just like Susan said, I don't think it's an issue at all. And the last thing you want to do is create this huge crater of space that's just used for a couple games out of the season.
Have customers complained to you about the parking situation either before or after the stadium is finished?
Yes, of course. But they're few and far between. Of course, we're going to get people who are used to, living in suburbs and having their own private garage that just aren't simply used to an urban lifestyle where you can walk, ride your bike. I mean, our trails have improved dramatically. Our cycling infrastructure has improved dramatically. I think that's all a very positive thing.
Do you think it's possible, now that we've been talking about all these extra new housing units, and obviously that's a source of new customers for you potentially, and it sounds like in reality so far. I mean, do you think it's possible that a lot of people in the more far-flung areas of Colorado Springs just simply aren't coming downtown anymore, but maybe it doesn't matter as much because you've got this new customer base?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the first part of that?
Do you think it's possible that people from the far-flung parts of Colorado Springs are just not coming anymore, but they're being replaced by folks from the city center?
Oh, no, I disagree with that. I think, if anything, it is creating a draw for those people who maybe didn't come downtown because, for lack of a draw, rather, that they're coming out more so than they were before.
Interesting. Okay, so the sort of stereotypical person from a far-flung suburb, the Black Forest comes to mind as one I remember from my days living in Colorado Springs. So people from areas like that, they came before, they're still coming, even though they might have complained to you at some point about the parking situation.
The people that are coming out far outweigh the people that are complaining.
Okay.
By leaps and bounds. I mean, I go to every single game and I'm very hands-on in my restaurant. So not only do I talk to tons of people at the game, I talk to lots of people that come into my restaurant, and several of whom have never been here before and are happy to make the trip to come down here. They might have a small issue with parking, but eventually they find it. I mean, I've seen for the first time in forever, there's pedicabs downtown now taking people to and from the stadium, which is so exciting and so inviting. And I think we're getting, if I heard correctly, we're getting a fleet of scooters as well.
Yes, scooters.
So not only will we have e-bikes, we'll have scooters, e-bikes and scooters and bike trails and pedicabs. I mean, these are all things that very progressive cities implement, which are far more progressive than giant parking garages.
I'll just add, it reminds me of that phrase, and I'm blanking on the name of the man who was always known for his malapropisms. That says that place is so busy, no one goes there anymore. It's like exactly. the irony of that, right? No, that place is a great problem to have. People love it, right? Yeah, and so again, I think we see that combination of, and not to just like people at a distance. We're still getting the families from the suburbs because they love the switchbacks and they love the experience in this very quality stadium that was created. So they're still coming and they're discovering downtown because maybe they weren't downtown people. And we're getting, if you will, more of our urbanites who are used to that experience a little bit more. so to me, I love that the variety of community that is in that space. It's becoming both the place where, if you will, community civic leaders and, the mayor's there or this, like, so it truly is a place where almost people get business done because it's a place for sort of civic leaders to see and be seen, and absolutely just everyday families having a good time. And I know that sounds like some marketing spin, but it really is an incredible mix of people who are there. And many of them were not downtown people before. And I was walking to a game a couple of weeks ago. And again, because I was walking from slightly further away and it was a weeknight, so it was a little bit quieter. It wasn't one of the bigger games or whatever. And I saw these like 4 or 5 guys who were like college age, and I could see them kind of looking at their phone and wandering around. And I almost did the nerdy thing of just walking up to them saying, "Can I help you? Are you lost?" But I didn't, right? And I just kept on walking one direction. And then eventually, as I make it to the stadium, I see them coming from a whole other direction. So it was clearly their first time in downtown. They were trying to figure out where they were going to the game or this or that. But they were exactly, again, just like new patrons who were discovering downtown for the first time and finding their way around.
Right, and they park in front of my restaurant and take up parking spots around my restaurant just to go to the game, and they don't come to my restaurant. It's okay, because they're going to have to walk past my restaurant, and they're going to see my son, and they're going to see that I'm there, and they perhaps never realized I was there in the first place. So it's just exposure. I don't feel like, they're taking up parking spots and costing me business. Quite the opposite. And I think it just brings out more exposure for us all.
We seem to be looping back time and again to the idea that this model works because it's sort of inefficient in an economically beneficial way. Is it just me, or is that kind of the idea that the downtown stadium forces people to spend more time walking around, and then inspires them to kind of meet friends there and do what they would do at a suburban stadium in a much longer time period? It seems like that is really kind of the secret sauce here. I guess I want to ask one more time just to make sure I'm getting this right.
No, you're totally off base. That's not at all that.
But just for an example, I went to a football game at Mile High Stadium a couple weeks ago. I walked far more than 10 minutes to get to that game, but I just walked through parking lot after parking lot after parking lot, and I saw nothing of interest other than, people that were interesting. So it's really not, even the model of a big parking lot around a stadium is not very efficient, because if you've got everybody has to get out of that same parking lot basically at the same time. And the way that this model works is, some people are walking 2 minutes, some people are walking 5 minutes, and some might be walking 15 minutes because they made that choice that they wanted to start at, this restaurant or this bar that's a little bit farther away. So even that model of the parking crater is not very efficient.
And we do not have traffic back, as I said, this stadium is very near the interstate. It is just like right off a major interstate exit. There is not a backup of traffic before or after the game. As Robert was alluding to earlier, there's not this whole like, oh my gosh, now we got to rush out because we're going to have to fight everything. It just doesn't, there's people, there's a lot of people on the streets and crossing the street, but there's not like this just kind of like sea of like waiting several, we've all been at the festivals or whatever, where you get in your car and then you just sit there for 15, 20 minutes trying to get out. That doesn't happen.
One more question kind of along these lines before we wrap up here, and that's transit. Now, Susan, you mentioned a circulator bus, which is coincidentally an idea that's being kicked around for downtown Albuquerque as well. But apart from that, do you see a major role for public transit for getting people to and from soccer games in sprawling mid-sized Western cities like ours?
Well, this circulator that will launch next year will be part of our transit system. So it is a form of rubber tire transit. And as Ari mentioned earlier, it really does take all pieces, right? So you can have a circulator or a bus, you can have scooters, bike share, all of those kinds of things I think are all important in this. But I will say all of those things are important and accessible beyond just a large event center. So they are additive, and the stadium becomes an impetus to make these things work. But those things are all part of making an entire growing downtown work. None of those things exist on their own just because of a stadium, you know, or vice versa, right? So it's a much more complex piece. And I will say, you know, again, similar cities here, I will be the first to say we do not have a robust transit system in a city of nearly 200 square miles, and that's an issue. But for our one square mile downtown core, having a circulator that's not just a game day circulator, but is operating for all the people in all the new apartments and hotels. The stadium's an important component of that, but this is where all these things become, you know, again, that domino effect, that there's the direct economic benefit of a stadium and then someone going out to eat or drink before or after, but it's also then what it catalyzes with all the other residential growth and business sustainability. As Ari said, she wouldn't have continued her business if she didn't see that there was this great thing coming up. So now her business is more viable. So there's primary effects and secondary effects, and you've got to look at both of them of what something like this can catalyze.
Ari, what do you think of the transit question? You mentioned walking, you mentioned scooters, you mentioned biking. Is that other leg of the non-motorized stool a factor for you or your customers or friends?
You know, because of the upgraded additions to our trails, to our sidewalks, the bike fleets, everything, I honestly, my car does not move. As somebody who lives downtown, my car does not move for several days, sometimes a week at a time. It's just not necessary anymore. And I think anybody who's ever resided in an urban section of a major city can attest to that. You just don't need your cars when we have all of these things in place. Now, do we have room for improvement? Absolutely. In our small little section, I can get around very easily. I can walk or ride my bike anywhere we need to go. But we could definitely improve when it comes to like a broader scale of public transportation.
All right, Robert, anything to add on the transit question there?
Well, I think they covered it pretty well.
All right. Okay, let me do a quick last call here. Any, you know, you're talking to a bunch of people who are about to vote as soon as next Tuesday on a stadium. I won't ask you for a recommendation on yay or nay on that, but let's assume we do vote yay. Is there anything else that you'd recommend we kind of keep in mind as we go forward in the coming months?
I don't know that I have any, you know, advice, but if you do vote yes, I think you're going to get something. You know, I found that this to be just a remarkable center of community for Colorado Springs, and it's exceeded. You know, I've been involved in it from the beginning, but it's exceeded my expectations in terms of what it means for people in Colorado Springs to have this. And you know, New Mexico United has probably the best fan base in the USL. That's one thing we're a little jealous of. And they travel well, they come to Widener Field, and you know, I think it would be received extremely, extremely well. You've got a fan base that's ready for it, I think.
All right, Susan, any, if we do go down this path, what should we know that you already know?
Again, as we've said, I think this can be something very catalytic, and I would just encourage, you know, assuming if this is a yes vote, just make thoughtful decisions, right? Like this was a very well designed stadium, and so important choices around making it activated and thinking about days that are not game days and things like giant parking craters. So those are really important decisions to make in the process. The stadium is catalytic, but you got to make good choices all along the way about the land use and the physical space, so that it is an active space, if you will. And I think really good design choices were made. And we didn't even start out with necessarily good design choices. And Widener invested a lot to improve the design. And so you've got to be really thoughtful about those kinds of decisions about walkability and how you get there before and after, and the quality of the facility to really deliver on it. And I feel so fortunate that with Widener's investment and good decisions that a really quality facility was created.
All right, and Ari, we'll end it with you here. Any pearls of wisdom from what could be Albuquerque's ghost of stadium future?
I would definitely say make sure to take careful consideration in the local businesses' input. It obviously has to be filtered. Everybody has an opinion, but it's important to include local businesses in this decision. But as a local business owner, 10 out of 10 would recommend vote yes.
All right, sounds good. Well, that is all the time we've got for tonight's program. I want to extend a special thanks to Susan Edmondson, Ari Knopp, and Robert Carr for being here tonight. Thanks also to Henry Lopez at the New Mexican for his technical wizardry and good cheer, and to Claire for fielding all the questions behind the scenes there. If you missed any part of this presentation, it'll be on YouTube in a couple of days, so please watch out for that. But for now, that is all from us on behalf of the Santa Fe New Mexican and Downtown Albuquerque News. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.